Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We are expecting quite a few attendees, so we're going to go ahead and get started. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar on understanding affordability and how to self-assess your rates. My name is Clark from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, and in a moment, I'll turn things over to Elsa Marie Mullins and Luke Andrews from the University of North Carolina and the University of New Mexico EFCs. This webinar is the first in several in our Spring Community Affordability series. We'd love for you to join us again on May 3rd to learn about customer empathy. You can visit efcnetwork.org to register and learn more. Now for some housekeeping items to keep in mind during this webinar. First, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. Please use the GoToWebinar question dialog box to ask questions and submit comments or thoughts anytime throughout the session. We will be certain to save time for questions throughout and at the end. You will be receiving a follow-up email that includes a link to all the materials from today, and PDFs of our presentation are available under the Handouts tab on your control panel for download now. This training has not been pre-approved for any kind of PDH or CEU credit. However, we will provide certificates as a courtesy. We can't guarantee that the training will receive pre-approval or that this training will meet any specific requirements. Please be sure to attend the entire session and participate in poll questions if available. And you must be registered and using your real name and unique email address in order for us to contact you. So please do that if you expect to receive a certificate. Your certificate of attendance will be emailed to you within 30 days of today's date, and if you have questions or need assistance with this, please contact us at smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about the Environmental Finance Center Network. Through training and technical assistance services, we help water and wastewater systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with clean and safe water regulations. Please note that as part of this work, we offer free professional technical services to small water and wastewater systems, and I will be sharing a link in the chat shortly to our assistance form that you can check out. And here you can see the various centers that make up the Environmental Finance Center Network. You can see that our centers and partner organizations are spread across the country to best serve regional and local needs. We work together to create solutions to difficult how-to-pay issues of environmental protection and improvement. And on that note, I'd like to hand things over to our first speaker, Elsa Marie Mullins. Elsa Marie Mullins is a project director at the University of North Carolina EFC. I'll make you a presenter now, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Tess. Share my screen. All right, so as Tess mentioned, I'm a project director at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill EFC, and this webinar is part of a series, and this first one is titled, Are Your Rates Affordable? So we're gonna go over kind of overview of affordability, and then we'll dig into two tools, one that we've created and one from the University of New Mexico EFC, and that'll be kind of the second part of the webinar. UNC is the Region 4, which takes care of the Southeast United States Environmental Finance Center. So we do a lot of work in North Carolina and around Region 4, but also all over the country. And I really enjoy both the technical assistance aspect of my work, as well as kind of the applied research and teaching, which is why we're here today. So quick overview. Today, in the first part, we're going to talk about what affordability is, why we care about it, and then how we measure it. And the tools will be included kind of in that third question. To get us started, I would love to hear from all of you. What is affordability? What comes to mind when you think about affordability? Go ahead and just throw it in the chat. Anything and everything goes. Also, Tess didn't mention this, but feel free to ask questions. Put your questions in the question panel, not in the chat panel, because it'll be much easier for us to answer them one by one in the questions. But go ahead and put in the chat what comes to mind when you think about affordability.
Folks, you might have to use the questions box. I think, Elsa Marie, unfortunately, we have like a one-way chat on here on GoToWebinar, but
Okay,
we've
go
got
ahead and
lots
put it
of
in the
good feedback.
questions.
Yeah,
Thank you,
lots of
Bess.
good feedback for you.
I see the ability to balance a cost into my budget, a rate that everyone can afford. We have a number, $30 per month. Nice. How much residents are willing to pay, monthly bill, achievable costs by entire service territory, ability to pay, having the funds to maintain and keep a water system working. Can most people afford their water most of the time? Okay, so we've kind of got a spectrum here of talking about, how to recover revenue for the utility, how to make sure the utility has funds to run, as well as how do we make sure rates are at a point where customers can pay them, and that it's a fair amount for the services provided. A reasonable rate, I like this one, a reasonable rate that helps the water company survive while not hurting the financial ability for the ratepayers to cover other bills. Being able to sustain improvements and operate. Right, so it's really, and we'll get into this, it's a mix of a lot of different things. And spoiler alert, there's not one clear definition here. For the purposes of this webinar, we're going to be focusing more on the ability of customers to pay, but how to be financially sustainable as a water utility is absolutely part of our work at the EFC. That's just not the focus necessarily of these webinars. These are kind of narrowing in on particularly customer affordability, not necessarily how to keep the whole utility running, although we have many more resources about that. So if you look around in the headlines, there's also a lot of different suggestions about what affordability is. We have a report that finds Flint, Michigan water to be unaffordable. What does that mean? There was a study on the rising bills for water and saying millions of Americans can't afford water bills. Water affordability is not just a local challenge, but a federal one. And a 2016 Food and Water Watch report came out calling it America's secret water crisis, and talking about water shutoffs, because that's often what happens when customers can't pay their bills, is their water is shut off, oftentimes for non-payment to help encourage payment. And in these kind of articles, there's kind of a clutch context piece that we're going to talk about first. In this one, the very first line of this article is, America has an infrastructure crisis. No one needs to look very far to see the challenges that water and wastewater systems are facing in maintaining, rehabilitating, and replacing their infrastructure. We're talking about all the infrastructure. Oh. Just a second. Not just things like wastewater treatment plants, but also tanks, meters, trucks, pumps, pipes, the whole 9 yards. All of the infrastructure needs to be maintained and rehabilitated. And as we know, this is a huge challenge. To protect the public health and provide clean drinking water and good wastewater services takes a lot of infrastructure. And much of the infrastructure was built with large investments from the federal government in the 70s. So there's this big spike in this graph that shows the federal investment on water and wastewater utility infrastructure. But that spending decreased in the following decades. And because utilities operate as enterprise funds, that is, they're trying to be self-sufficient by meeting their expenses with their revenues, the vast majority of the revenues, which come from rates, they need to raise rates in order to cover the cost of even just maintaining that infrastructure, much less replacing it. This is even a larger challenge for small systems, because the cost of building and operating a plant doesn't necessarily change much between, say, like 500 or 1,000 customers, but the cost would be double for the system with 500 versus 1,000. So in a larger area, you can spread out the costs over more customers. There's kind of an economies of scale. Additionally, many small systems are in rural areas, which have a lower population density, and that equates to more pipe per customer. So not only might there be fewer customers to cover the cost of a large treatment plant, the absolute cost of the treatment plant might be higher, or the absolute cost of the pipes might be higher than in another system because the customers are farther apart. So a quick side note, there is a big investment in water and wastewater right now because of the ARPA funds that are coming down and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And feel free to email me about those. I've been tracking those. And a lot of money is going to be coming through the state revolving funds for those projects. But the truth is, one, that money isn't going to be enough to fix everything. And two, even if that money does replace your treatment plant right now, there's no guarantee that we'll get another large investment in another couple of decades. And you'll need to still plan to replace that plant when it runs out of its useful life. So the money right now is great, but it's not really enough to cover all the needs. So the rates are going to keep going up for this service. And there are customers who don't have the same increases in income to easily pay for the higher water rates. And they can't afford their water bill. So this is where the affordability discussion comes in. It's a balancing act. It's the ability of customers to pay or not for water or wastewater bills, the impact of rate increases on customers. Essentially, it's how do your rates impact your customers? Now, notice this isn't a yes or no question. So the title of the webinar is a little misleading. Are your rates affordable? I'm not going to tell you yes or no to that. It's really a judgment. It's a whole set of judgment calls that decision makers, that's utility staff, elected officials, you have to make for your community. And it has implications. So we're going to get into kind of how to measure this, how do your rates affect your customers. But first, we're going to talk about why we might care how our rates affect our customers. So why would you care about affordability, and how I'm defining it is how your rates affect your customers. And why do we care about measuring that? So huge reason to care about the impact of the bills on the customers is to protect public health. Oftentimes, someone who cannot pay, I mentioned this, kind of gets disconnected, which means they're not actually be able to use the service of safe, clean drinking water. And we want to kind of keep folks connected. Oftentimes, and COVID highlighted this, right? So if folks are disconnected from their water, how can they wash their hands? That was kind of a big narrative there. So the baseline, we want to have, be able to provide the service to our customers. We want our customers to be able to pay their bills so that the systems can meet their revenue requirement, which can be a challenge, as I mentioned, for small systems, because you can't spread out those revenue needs to as many customers. Additionally, it can really help to understand the impact of your bills on customers when you're communicating to your decision makers about rate increases and how that's going to affect your customer population. You can also, especially when you're measuring affordability, compare to other utilities, although we would caution you that no two utilities are exactly the same, and you need to take into consideration the entire financial picture as well as the affordability. There are also compliance needs. So the EPA cares about affordability from the community level because you can, if you do the financial capability assessment and demonstrate a need in your community and say, our community would really struggle to pay for these Clean Water Act obligations, it's really from the clean water side, then you might get a different timeline on when you need to meet compliance. This is undergoing revision right now, but that's kind of the original origins of the percent MHI metric that we'll talk about later, is this context of meeting Clean Water Act obligations and saying, my community can't afford kind of what is needed to meet these obligations in this timeline. And I just wanted to throw in kind of with this, that in general, one of the special challenge for small systems is that there's often not the administrative support to measure affordability in a community and talk about it and share it with decision makers. That's where some of the tools that we're offering today come into handy. That you can use those to analyze affordability in your community and talk to folks about that. And we also do that in the one-on-one technical assistance that Tess mentioned. So you can feel free to fill out that form and we can talk to you about that one-on-one. There are also other reasons to care about affordability. What about the tenant that has a leaky pipe and landlord won't fix it? And so the tenant can't pay his or her bill. And they might get disconnected or have a super high bill because of the landlord's apathy. I heard a story about a middle schooler who didn't want to play football, who had to quit football because they lost water service at his house because he didn't want to be the stinky kid. In some places, liens are put on houses for water bills. So what about that single mom who, maybe lost her job because of COVID and can't pay her water bill? Like, do we really want to make sure she loses her house so that she pays that bill? There's this personal element to it. There's always going to be people who have a hard time paying for different reasons. And that really matters as well. And I would argue that's even more challenging in a small system setting because the billing clerk in your town might actually know every person who's having trouble paying their bill. It's a bit more personal because it's a smaller system. So these are a whole mix of things. And really the first couple, we're going to talk about how measurements can help with, kind of understanding your service area and measuring affordability across it. And then the second set, we'll talk a bit more about empathy and then maybe how you can help those customers who will just always have a hard time paying in the future. But one big reason to measure affordability is so that you can provide adequate assistance to begin with. It's kind of a good baseline, and that's what we're talking about today. There's different metrics you can use, a lot of different things you can do, but it's really just all a way to kind of get at a picture of what's going on. And as you think about all these things, you can see that it feels like a plate of spaghetti. Pulling on this piece of can your customer pay your bill brings up all kinds of questions. How does your utility look at rate setting? What are your rate structures? How do you collect bills? How do your disconnections work? What are your fees and fines for non-payment? Like I said, how do you disconnect? What kind of assistance programs are out there, either run by the utility or run by a third-party nonprofit? How do you pay for that assistance? This kind of brings up all kinds of issues, and we'll talk about some of these in the coming webinars, but I just want to mention that, in addition to this kind of big picture context for today, we're just going to be focusing on the metrics of measuring your rates and how they impact your customers and assessing affordability in your community. All those other discussions are really good and really important, but there's too much to cover for one webinar. So if addressing affordability in your community is not a yes or no kind of binary question of are your rates affordable, we'll be talking about different ways to measure this, different angles and considerations, and ultimately it will be all information you can bring to you and your decision makers to continue that discussion and determine kind of what you would want to do about any concerns that you have. So for affordability assessments, there are really two main components, and they're already embedded in this question. One is your rates, your prices for services. And keep in mind, some people like to measure affordability also thinking about anything that's included on the bill. So that might include solid waste, stormwater, recycling, any number of other charges, because oftentimes water utilities bill for the other services. And we need billing information. So there's also kind of a whole discussion about consumption, which affects bills, and we'll talk about that in kind of a rate setting webinar later. But baseline is kind of what is your rates? That's the first part of measuring affordability. The second part is your customers. So we can get a lot of information and other demographics from the census website, and we'll be talking about that today. But also part of your customers is knowing who your service population is. So you need to know your surface area boundaries, and then especially how that overlaps with census data, which sometimes can be tricky. But essentially oh yeah, and that's especially true if you're serving folks outside your town limits, which is pretty common. So census data, the benefit is that it's easily accessible and readily available for everywhere, but it also has a margin of error. So it's a great starting point to understand your community, and that's where kind of this like how we do assessments is we kind of have to start somewhere at this large scale. But you also know your community best, and you know the customers that are having trouble paying. So you kind of keep all of that information in mind when you're thinking about it. So when you put together your rates information, your demographic information that's kind of in place because of your service boundary, you get many different kinds of affordability metrics. So we're going to go into some of how to measure affordability using different pieces, different sets of this sort of data, and some of the metrics that EPA uses to evaluate financial capability. All of them are some combination of rates and customer information. So we'll go into each a bit and then show how it's displayed when we get to the tools. But that's kind of the basic comparison. So for the rate side, we will be including base charge, volumetric charge, and then there's also consumption allowance. Sometimes folks have an allowance that's included in that base charge. So they might charge $50 as a base charge, but included in that consumption allowance is 3,000 gallons of uses a month or whatever. And to get this rates information, as I'm demonstrating the calculations, we're only going to use one number, but you can remember that different customers have different consumption needs, a large family, for example, whether or not you charge differently for irrigation, all those sorts of things can matter too. For simplicity's sake, we'll just be using one number, but you can always do a range of calculations if you like to. So that's the rates piece. The second part of the equation is income. So income is usually the biggest demographic data piece that we use to talk about calculating affordability. And we like to look at, especially kind of as folks are seeing the limitations of just using 1% MHI number, we want to kind of look at the whole entirety of the income buckets. So on the left axis is the percent of population, and then that's for each of these income buckets. And you'll notice that not all the income buckets are equal. So the first bucket is less than 10K, second is 10 to 15, 15 to 25. So those deviations are different. Those divisions are smaller at the lower end of the spectrum. And this is because that's how the census data is portrayed. So we kind of want to break up the lower end of the income spectrum, and then it kind of lumps, everybody from 100 to 150K in the same bucket on the other side. So real quick, we're going to talk about median household income. This is a metric that a lot of folks have used because of how the EPA kind of first threw it out there as one metric. It gets a lot of flack because it's only a sliver of the complex picture of affordability. But in order to measure and compare, the EPA felt like they needed to start somewhere. And you do have to simplify in order to do that. So there are many other good ways which we'll go into, but I just want to talk a little bit about percentiles and what that looks like. So for this example, the median household income is where it's always where 50% of the population is below the MHI. In this case, it's around 62,000 in this example of a population, and 50% makes above the MHI. That's kind of the basic definition. And one way that folks have often talked about affordability is what percent of MHI is the average bill. So that only looks at kind of the middle 50%. It doesn't look at all the buckets. It's kind of the most simplistic way to look at it. So one of the reasons that can be troublesome is displayed in this next graph. So in this case, MHI is the same for both of these populations, the one on the top and the one on the bottom. But if you look at the lower income bracket, you can see the population on the lower graph has a much higher percentage of folks that make less than 10,000. So the lower income population is different in distribution and total, but so it's different. The distributions are different on that lower end of the spectrum, and those are the folks that are actually going to be having a hard time paying. So it's important to kind of look at that picture too. And one way that we can do this is that would be just as simple to calculate as MHI, would be taking the lower quartile indicator. So this is the same calculation at MHI, but only with the lower 20% of customers. And in this example, you can see the MHI is the same for both populations, but in the top distribution, the lower quintile is in the $26,000 range, and the bottom distribution, the lower quintile is in the $13,000 range, and that's half of the income. So there's a way to kind of get at looking at the distribution from the lower income side with that lower quartile income. That would be just as easy as the MHI, and we'll go into more of that calculation, but I just want to demonstrate that it doesn't have to always be MHI. So in addition to income, there's a lot of other demographic data that can be used. Unemployment, poverty level, percent of population on Social Security, the home ownership and the percent of vacant homes, the trend in household growth, folks on SNAP, EBT, food stamps. There's so much more. There's also data that isn't necessarily available from the Census Bureau, and you can bring in other expenses like housing and childcare and food and transportation, kind of these other discretionary income, these other pieces that will need to be paid for. So kind of trying to take out the cost of living expenses, essentially. So as you can see, you can really dig into data and try to get as detailed as possible. For this webinar, we're going to go through a couple examples of some of the most commonly used metrics, and more of these will pop up in the tool demos. And also, while the EPA has some thresholds for some of these metrics, they can all be argued that they're fairly arbitrary. It's a way to compare across utilities, but there's not really a hard and fast reason for a lot of these thresholds. So I'm not going to be focusing on the thresholds because it's really these metrics are a way to kind of prompt discussion amongst you and your decision makers about what you think is reasonable in your community. So we're going to be calculating metrics for the town of Manio, North Carolina, which is on Roanoke Island before you get to Kitty Hawk and Mag's Head and Kill Devil Hills in North Carolina. Manio has a service population of, the water service has a service population of 2,638 people. So we'll be using their information to do these calculations. So first off is the medium household income, percent medium household income, also called the residential indicator. So this is the rates data. The annual service costs for consumption is $1,070.16. And the median household income, which comes from the census table DPO3, is $48,375. So the service costs divided by the household income multiplied by 100 to get the percentage is 2.1%. And this is the annual service at 5,000 gallons per month for water and sewer. So that's a kind of basic way to calculate the residential indicator. Next up is, I've already kind of mentioned this, is the percent lowest quintile income indicator. So this is also called the household burden indicator, and it is essentially the same calculation, but instead of using the MHI for the income, for the demographic data, we use the lowest quintile income, and the census table is on there too. So in this case, it's equal to 5.88% of the annual income for the lowest quintile is that annual service cost. So they're essentially the same thing, just one with median household income and the other with the lower quintile. Another indicator metric that some folks use is the poverty prevalence indicator. And this actually doesn't use any rates data. It's just looking at the community and what percent of their population is below 2% of the poverty level. So in this case, for Manio, that's 37%, which is pretty high. EPA has 35%. If it's over 35%, it's kind of indicated as a high burden area for the poverty prevalence indicator. Next up, we have hours at minimum wage. So this one again uses some rates data and some demographic data. In this case, it's minimum wage, which we got from the U.S. Department of Labor minimum wage and hour division, and that's multiplied by 100 to get, or that's just a straight division. You know, how many hours do you have to work in order to pay your bill? And there's no threshold here. Basically, lower is better. That means you're like working less hours. And I think this metric is really helpful just as a way to think about if you were working minimum wage, you know, how long would it take you to pay your bill, and kind of personalize it. You know, it'd take a day and a half of work, and all that time would be spent just paying the water bill in this case. The next one I'm going to show is a little bit complicated, so just bear with me. And part of this is just so that these slides are here for you to reference later. And this is the affordability ratio. And this is where the essential costs are subtracted from that lowest quintile income. So this are things like housing, food, healthcare, utilities that aren't water, and taxes. And it can be really tough to get those numbers for your specific area. So I just estimated those for Manio. Those aren't from a table or anything, because those are really specific to your locality. So this is kind of another way to get at, for the lowest income population, you know, what from their discretionary income are they going to be able to spend, are they going to need to spend on their water? So in this case, it's at 25, almost 26% of their income they would spend on their monthly service costs. So that's a quarter of, you know, what they have after they pay for what's included in this. And you can get down to super granular details if you wanted to. But it's not necessarily helpful to try to get exact numbers as much as, you know, these are all metrics that kind of are different ways to look at this pile of spaghetti. To kind of, there can be top level view. The data is only going to be as good as the census data. And it's good to view it from different angles and benchmark it to others. So it's helpful to have these metrics. And good to look at these things. That's why we're doing this webinar. And there will also always be customers who can't pay. So as you're looking at these metrics, as you're thinking about the fact there will always be customers that can't pay, what do? You know, what's the answer? And the truth is there is no silver bullet for this. It's going to be unique to your community, your utility and practices, and more. There's not just one silver bullet, but I can give you several bullet points to think about the issue. Well, none of these are going to be, you're not helpless in thinking about it. It's a complex issue, but there are places to start. So I'm going to go through some things that you can be thinking about as you're measuring affordability and this whole kind of complex issue. One, first off, is encouraging your water utility sustainability. Can your system survive and thrive? What will help your customers have clean water into the future? Just keeping your rates low so that everybody can pay them all the time. If that's your primary goal, then you're probably not recovering the revenue that you need in order to replace that pump when it breaks, or save up for the treatment plant that you're going to need in 20 years, or buy that backup generator for when a hurricane comes through. So just having low rates isn't going to help your citizens have water in the coming decades, because at some point that will lead to a failure of the system. So starting off with actually providing the service and wanting to know if you can do that into the future. Another huge one you can do is get to know your customers and their challenges with bill payment. Not all of your customers will have trouble. Some of them will have trouble for different reasons. And that can help you, that kind of information helps you set the stage for what you might do about it. You can also examine your rate structure. We're going to talk more about that on the June 7th webinar, so you can look for that coming up. You can also evaluate your fees and procedures for late payment and possibly other policies like disconnection, and see, you know, how you can help the folks that are having trouble paying and still, you know, encourage that payment to happen. You can also consider flexible billing, efficiency programs, and more. And some of those are considered bill payment assistance or customer assistance programs, part of which can also be a bill payment assistance. So we'll have more on customer assistance programs, including bill payment assistance, during the July 12th webinar, and there'll be a workshop in August as well as part of the series. So this series is going to talk, more about customer empathy, rate structures, customer assistance programs. But it's important to remember there is still kind of the great need for infrastructure investment. So it's important to remember that you still need to recover your revenue as you're considering what to do about the folks in your service area that might have a hard time paying. So with that, I'm going to say thank you for your attention for the first part of this webinar. Here's my email again. And on this slide, there's just links to the next webinar that you can register for. And we're going to maybe test if there are just a couple questions that we could do now, and then we'll move on to talking about and demoing the tools that will help you assess affordability in your community.
Sure. Yeah, it looks like we just have one question and sort of a clarification about what a lien will do to somebody if there is a lien on their house. So I don't know if you wanted to speak about like what kind of impact liens have on water bills.
Yeah, and depending on the states, there can be different rules about liens for water bills, but so if somebody owes, say, $3,000 on a water bill and it's put as a lien on their house, that means whenever they want to sell their house, they need $3,000 of that sale will have to go to the water bill. And if the utility decides to collect that bill and they absolutely cannot pay, then sometimes that leads to the property being taken and sold so that bill can be paid. So it's kind of not a great scenario, but why I mentioned, the single mom losing her house in that first slide.
Awesome. I think we can move on.
All right. So I'm going to demo the kind of affordability assessment tool that we have from our UNC EFC, and then my colleague Luke from the Southwest EFC will take it away with the other tool. All right, so this tool is linked in the webinar description, so you can feel free to follow along if you like. But this is kind of, our tool is really built to be a broad overview that's pretty easy to use to get you a quick answer about, how do your rates impact your customers. So first off, we have this instruction tab that kind of goes through how to enter the information. And like I said, these metrics, there's going to be a portion about rates and a portion about demographics, just like most of the metrics, incorporates both of those pieces of data. That's kind of the basis of affordability metrics. So the first part is going to be defining your service area. And we do that by selecting a state. We're going to look at North Carolina. And then we can click on a county. We're going to look at Bladen County, North Carolina, because I'm working with a small utility there lately called Elizabethtown. So we're going to click on that. And this is the way, I know where I'm going. I found my town. And then I enter my rate information. And this is just really your average residential charge. And it doesn't have to be at 4,000 gallons consumption. You can put in whatever you want. And then there's also this alternative charge. So I'm just going to put in $40 here because that's kind of the average monthly charge for these customers. But the utility is considering about raising their rates. So I'm going to put in 50 as that alternative charge. And the nice thing about our tool is that you can kind of easily compare just that average charge from what your rates are now to what you might want them to be in the future. So going on to the next page, I get kind of this assessment of demographics. So this is the socioeconomic metrics. up here on the left, we have, and in all of these cases, the green bars are compared to, is the census place, that's the Elizabethtown data. And that is compared to the blue bars, which is the state data. So, and in any case where the census place data might be more distressed than the state data, so in this example, the MHI is much lower, like half the MHI of the state, that is indicated by this red label at the bottom. So we can see here, Elizabethtown has an MHI of about 26,000. And then here, since the poverty rate is higher than the state poverty rate level, again, almost, well, more than twice as much, the label down here is going to be red. Here we also see there's a higher percentage of the population that are unemployed, and a higher percentage of the population than the state that's aging, and that can kind of, that's on Social Security, and so interpret that as aging population. And that can be helpful as you're thinking about affordability, and which of your, what percentage of your customers might be on a limited income, and knowing kind of, what the options are for different customers can be helpful as you're thinking about how your rates impact your customers. There's also on here the percent of households with SNAP benefits. So again, more than double kind of the state average for SNAP or EBT, also known as food stamps. And then the Social Security supplemental income, which is kind of just above and beyond the Social Security income, and it's not actually funded by Social Security, but you have to apply for it through Social Security, is here, and that's just another measure of another socioeconomic measure. So this kind of helps set the stage for thinking about, okay, what are the folks in my population here? If we go on to the next page, we see the assessment. So I'm going to zoom in here a little bit because some of the text is a little bit small. I'll start off just kind of describing this graph, and then we can look a little bit closer. This shows the income buckets, like I displayed in the tool, or in the presentation. And these again are the ones from the census data. So even though they're all kind of the same width here, remember that the lower income brackets have smaller deviations. So you can get kind of more granular data at the lower income brackets. So this blue kind of mountain landscape, that is the percent of the population that is in each bracket group. So for example, in this income group, and if you toggle over, as you can see, it'll pop up that information. In that income group from 35 to 50,000, 14% of the population is in that income group. And that's the axis on the right side of the graph. On the left side, the y-axis is showing the percent as annually spent on bills. So this is kind of the percent MHI or LQI for each income bracket. So for this lowest income bracket, making between 0 and 10,000, they'd be spending an average of 4.8% on their water and wastewater bill. And it's important to note here that the red ones are just considered the low income customers, those who make under 25,000, which is a definition from the federal government. And this is the top graph is, with the current rates that I put in there, $40. And then the bottom graph is the alternate rates. So this is because it went from $40 to $50, all of these percentages that are being used to pay for their water wastewater bills are higher percentages. But the landscape graph is the same for each population. So there's still 14%, making between 35 and 50,000. One of the things that's important to note too, or that is just I find really interesting, is to toggle between all households versus homeowners. So the homeowners, this changes the population buckets. So you can see now between 35 and 50,000, the percentage of population of the people who own their houses, there's only 9% of those. And this can give you an idea of, just how many how much of your service population are homeowners versus renters, because that can really affect someone's bill. Are they paying for their water through their rent or separately from their rent? How much control do they have over fixing leaks or appliances? That sort of thing. So that can be helpful sometimes to know, how are these charges affecting which of your customers, which is a basic question. So that's kind of the broad overview of our tools, and I'm happy to answer more questions later. But for now, I'm going to pass it to Luke to go over the assessment tool from the University of New Mexico's EFC, and then we'll probably have time for some questions at the end as well.
All right, and thank you so much, Elsemarie. So yeah, I'll share my screen here, get myself set up here. All right. So yeah, my name is Luke Andrews. I work at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, and we're a part of the EFC network, and we promote self-reliance through innovative training and assistance focused on actionable results. And we do that by providing direct technical assistance and trainings to water and wastewater utilities. So I'm a research scientist at the SWEFC, and as part of my role there, I do a lot of work with water rates and affordability, as well as other things like GIS projects, and I'm a part of the tribal program as well. And so I'm actually going to just jump right into a walkthrough of our tool, which is the Water Affordability Self-Assessment Tool. So here we are on the main page of the Water Affordability Self-Assessment, or the WASA tool, as we like to call it. And before we dig into it, I just want to talk a bit about the tool itself. So this is a tool that water utility personnel, it's designed for you to use to assess how affordable your current rates or average monthly bills are for the communities that you serve, and to see how changes to those rate structures or monthly bills would affect affordability. So the user provides the tool with their local minimum wage and their billing information, or rate structure information. That's what the user needs to bring to the tool. And the tool uses that information along with data from the US Census to calculate various metrics of affordability, which we'll look at a little more deeply as we encounter them. So this is a browser-based tool, so there's no need to download anything, but it does require an active connection to the internet in order for you to use it. So on this page, we've got 3 links beneath the banner here that take you to the 3 main sections of the tool. So right now we're in the introduction section here. In the locations section, that's where we can select the geographical area that would best represent your utility. And in the assessment section, that's where you can enter your billing info and see the affordability assessments. So beneath that, in the instruction box, we've got a brief explanation of the tool and how it works. But let's go ahead and get started. So we can click this next button or the continue button here to move on to the location section. So here we are on the select a state page. So there's kind of 4 stages of this geographic locational selection, where you can select a state, then a county, then a city, and then a zip code. So we have all these available so that you can get down to the level that best represents your utility. So for instance, if you're a utility that serves the entirety of a county, then you would want to select that county and skip selecting a city or a zip code. If you're a utility that was smaller and served only part of a city or a small town, then choosing a zip code might be a better fit. And so here we can select the state that our utility is in, and we're going to go with New Mexico here. Add that in, and we're gonna pull up an example of a county in New Mexico as we go through these instructions. And so now we can continue on to the counties page, and this is going to be populated based on the selection that we made previously. So we selected New Mexico, and so now these are all New Mexico counties. So let's look at McKinley County. Type that in, add that there. Okay, and so from here, we've selected McKinley County, and we want to just see the assessment for McKinley. So we could just click continue to assessment. For now, we're going to just look at these just so you can see they're there. So now we're on the select your cities page. And I forgot to mention that at each of these stages, you can actually select multiples. So you could select multiple counties, multiple cities, multiple zip codes, multiple states even. But obviously you'd want to limit that to what is relevant to you. So here we've got our list of cities populated based on our previous county selection. And like we said, we don't need that. So we're just going to continue on. And here we've got a list of zip codes. So again, these are going to be populated on your previous selections. And you could select a zip code here and then continue to the assessment. We're not going to select one because, again, we're sticking with that county that we already grabbed. And just note that the smallest geography that you select through this process will be the one that's used for the assessment. So if you select a state, a county, a city, and a zip code, then when you go to the assessment, you're going to be seeing the assessment for your selected zip code. If you select a state and a county like we just did and go to the assessment, then you'll be seeing that assessment using the census data at the county level. So you only want to drill down as deep here as you want to go to accurately represent your utility. So let's continue on. All right, so here we are in the assessment section of the tool. And at the center of the page, you can see that there's these 4 buttons for different pages of the assessment section. We've got instructions, average monthly bill, rates, and comparison. And you can see that here, the instructions button highlighted. So we're on the instructions page, and you can refer back here for instructions on how to input your average monthly bill or your rates. And so from here, you can either go to the average monthly bill page or the rates page, depending on how you'd like to proceed. And so at the average monthly bill page, you can enter the average bill that a customer pays each month. And at the rates page, you can build out the actual rate structure that the community uses. So if you just want to get an idea of how affordable your rates are right now, the average monthly bill is the easiest way of doing that. But if you want to take a look at how changing your rates would affect affordability, then you need to do that within the rates table here. And so we're going to cover this a little more closely in a later example, but for now, let's look at the average monthly bill. And so here on the right, you've got instructions for how to use the page. And on the left, you can enter the average bill your customers pay each month and the local minimum wage. So after you've input this information, you can click the calculate button and you can see the results of your assessment. And we'll just look at this quickly here. So on the rates page, you can enter all your information on your rate structure. On the left, we can do a consumption allowance if need be. If we use a flat rate structure, we can just add a final block and just put that rate there. If we've got a block rate structure, we can add out all these blocks with their different rates and consumption levels there. And, so after that, you've got your monthly usage in gallons, a base charge if you have one, and the local minimum wage. And then you would be hitting that calculate button again. And just like with the average monthly bill, what this all together really does is produces an average monthly bill using these rates. And so it's really the same thing, but it allows you to play around with how that structure works and see the impacts of those changes on the overall affordability. So let's just add some dummy data here. And again, we selected McKinley County in New Mexico. So we'll have an average monthly bill of $50. And let's say that the local minimum wage is $10. We'll go ahead and calculate that. And I'm going to go, so beneath the where you've done your calculation, we've got all of these metrics here, and there's also the comparison table. And I'm going to start here because it gives you a more general idea than the specific metrics do. And so here we've got a table that, for all of these various different data points, right? Population, percentage of people in poverty, percentage of people getting food stamps and SNAP benefits, the median household income, and the unemployment rate. And so what we have is we've got all of those data points for our selected geography, which is McKinley County in this case. It's being compared to those values for the state, and it's also being compared to those values for the United States. And so what we have here are these indicators that kind of show you how you're doing in comparison to your selected state and the country. And so this county is, it's pretty economically challenged. We can see that our poverty rates are much higher than that of the state, and they're much higher than that of the nation. Food stamp and SNAP benefits, again, we're getting those at a higher rate than New Mexico and the US. And our median household income is lower than New Mexico and that of the United States. And again, the unemployment rate, that is also higher than New Mexico and the United States. And so, if it's quite a bit worse, you get this red exclamation point. If it's a little worse, you'll get a yellow exclamation point. And if it's good, then you'll get a green check mark there. And down here, we've got some graphs that show you the same data points, but in a graphical layout so that you can see a little more clearly the differences between. So here's the selected county poverty rate compared to the state and the United States. Right, you can see our income is down, our unemployment is up, our food stamps and public assistance is up. So that kind of tells us that, hey, this county is economically challenged right off the bat without even looking at our rates. Like, this is an area where affordability is likely to be something that people are concerned about. So that's something we need to pay attention to. So we'll go back here where we calculated these based on the average monthly bill and local minimum wage. We come down and we've got these indicators. And Else Marie did a great job of explaining these earlier. But this is that same metric we looked at, the hours needed at minimum wage to pay the average monthly bill. So this one's pretty easy math. At $50 for the bill, $10 an hour, it takes you 5 hours to earn the money to pay that bill. And on the left, we've got the benchmarks for what would represent a cost burden. And here, between 4 to 8 hours is a mild cost burden. Less than 4 is good, and over 8 is a high cost burden. So at 5, it's okay. It's not great, but it's not horrible. So there's a bit of some pressure there on people that make minimum wage in order to pay that bill. So this is the household burden indicator that Else Marie was talking about, the cost of service as a percentage of the lowest quintile income. You can click here to get a more detailed description of what that really means. But basically, it's the cost of the bill as a percentage of the income of the bottom 20% of incomes for that area. And so our benchmarks here, you really want it to be less than 1% to be good. It's kind of medium between 1 and 2, and it's considered to be pretty burdensome cost if it's above 2% of their total income. And so we come out, it's 4.58%. So that's really bad. The people at the bottom income levels are likely to have a difficult time affording bills in this community. So that tells us, hey, we need to look at those rates and really reassess, our customer base's ability to pay them. Again, this is dummy data, just to explain that. So this is the EPA residential indicator, and this is the one that, similar to the previous metric, but instead of using the lowest quintile, it uses the median household income, which is the middle point of the range of incomes. So what this one does is it gives you a really great idea of the kind of affordability of your quote unquote average customer, people in the middle, and obviously people that are above that in the income range are going to have an even easier time affording bills. So if this indicator comes up green, then it's likely that, you know, a pretty decent proportion, the majority of your community is not going to be too challenged in terms of paying that bill. And again, it's got those same benchmarks of, you know, 1%, 1 to 2, and 2%. And we've come out at 1.62. So that's probably higher than we want it to be, especially considering we're looking at the middle ground. So even the average customer in this community might have a difficult time affording that bill. So, you know, the rate reassessment is going to be really important for this community. And at the very bottom, we've got the distribution of customers by the percentage of income that they spend on water bills. And so we can click here to get a little bit more information if you need it, but I'll just go ahead and explain. So on the left, we've got all of this data in a table view. And on the right is a graph that depicts the exact same data set. And so, you know, here in the blue line, this shows the percentage of their income that would be spent on the bill at these various income levels that you can see along the bottom. And that's what's shown here as well. And this yellow line shows the percentage of people in the community that are at those income levels and would thus be paying that percentage of the bill. And that is shown here. And so what we'd want to do is, you know, we kind of previously established that what we're looking at is this 2%. You know, if you're above that, it's going to be a cost burden for you. And so we kind of find that here, and there's our 2%. And so we can see, you know, 12.24% is paying 2%. We've got 14 at 3, almost 8 paying almost 5%, and so on, right? And so you can add these numbers in this column up here and see the percentage of the community that would be paying over that 2% of their bill. And here, I mean, you can add this up, and it's coming pretty close to 50% if you add all those up. So, you know, that tells this community that they're in a pretty dire position, and they would need to seriously consider, you know, changing their rates in order for it to be affordable for their customer base. So now we'll click this button here, and we'll start a new session, and we'll take a look at a different community. And this time we're going to look at a different county in New Mexico that is quite affluent. So we can see, you know, that last one was a county in New Mexico that is economically challenged. Now we're going to look at an affluent community so that we can just get an idea of how things look. And again, oh, I need to get my county, Los Alamos. We'll grab that. And we're looking at the county level, so I don't need to get a city and I don't need to get a zip code. So I'm just going to continue right on to the assessment. And I'm going to use the same dummy data. $50 bill, $10 minimum wage. Hit calculate. All right, and so we can see this is the exact same value because this metric is so simple. It's just looking at the bill and the minimum wage. So that's not using any of the census data. And so for this example, we're just going to ignore that one for now. We'll move on to cost of service as percent of the lowest quintile income. And again, right, we know that this one is looking at our lower income members of the community. So this is supposed to tell us how those people are going to fare paying that bill. And we come in at 107. So we're right there in the mild cost burden. So, you know, it's good, not great. We're not in the green zone, but we're in the low end of the yellow. You know, that's something that you might see that and think, hey, you know, we're doing pretty good. EPA residential indicator, again, this is the one that looks at the median household income. So you're kind of looking at the middle of the range there. And the fact that we're in the green zone on that is great. That tells us that a very large percentage of the community is going to be able to pay these bills. So that is good. So all these things taken together, and also we'll just look briefly at the comparison table, right? Green checks all the way down. Everything looks good. So all those things taken together kind of let you know that, hey, this affordability probably isn't something that we need to be too concerned with. But then you come down here and you look at this more detailed breakdown of the income distribution among the population. We find that 2% cutoff again, right? And then we look at how many people are here, and you add these up, and it's roughly 10%. So, despite the fact that this is an affluent community and they performed really well on all of these metrics, it's still true that for 1 in 10 people of the community, they're actually paying at a rate that would be considered to be unaffordable. So, it's a complex kind of calculation to figure this stuff out, and you really have to dig into the nitty gritty and kind of look closely to figure out, the true picture of community affordability. So, even though they're doing great, maybe they need to go back to the drawing board and look at their rates again and see if there's a way that they can reconfigure things to kind of alleviate the cost burden on that lower end of their income level. And we're actually going to look now at an example of doing just that. So we'll start a new session again. And this example, we're going to build out a rate table, so you'll get to see that. And we're going to do this for the city of Santa Fe. So we're going to grab the state of New Mexico. We'll continue on to the counties. The city of Santa Fe is in the county of Santa Fe. So we'll add Santa Fe County, continue to cities, and we'll just scroll through this brief list of cities in Santa Fe County. There's the city of Santa Fe, add that, and we will continue to the assessment. And we'll just look quickly at the comparison. So city of Santa Fe, right, it's not doing quite as well as Los Alamos, but it's doing good. Nothing's in the red, lots of green check marks, some yellow. We're doing, it's kind of medium plus. So we'll go here and we're on our rates page, and I went ahead and looked up what is the city of Santa Fe's rate structure. So they actually will charge a different rate structure depending on what time of year it is. We're in April here, so we'll go ahead with that. And so they charge $6.06 per 1,000 gallons for the first 7,000 gallons. So we'll put that in here as we don't have a consumption allowance, so we're not going to use that. So we'll just start with that first block, $6.06 for the first 7,000 gallons. And you can click on all of these things to get more information about what we're doing here. This is designed to work whether you're doing multiples of 1,000 gallons or whether you're working in cubic feet, which is equivalent to 748 gallons per unit. You can do multiples of 748 as well. So we've got our first block there. And then it looks like just jumps all the way up to 2172 after that. And that just continues on to the end. So that will be our final block because it doesn't have an ending. And that was 2172. Oh, did I not add that to the table? I didn't add this to there we go. Add to table. So we click that. Sorry, I forgot to add my first block to the table. I didn't click the add button. So we've got that one. Now we can do the final block here. 2172. Okay, we'll add this. Okay. So our rate table is complete. We've also got to add the monthly usage, the base charge, and the local minimum wage. We are going to stick with the average monthly usage of U.S. households. That's 4,000 gallons. Let's look at our base charge. So we're gonna assess this for a residential customer. They likely have that 5/8 or 3/4 inch meter. So they're gonna pay that base charge of $18.42. $18.42. And what is the local minimum wage in the city of Santa Fe? I've looked that up. It is $12.95 per hour. So $12 $12.95. And then we hit calculate. Okay, and so we can see right here it shows this is the bill that was calculated. So that's the flat 1842 base charge added right in there. And then with 4,000 gallons of usage within this rate structure. So all of that would be in the first block. So it's just 4 times $6.06 plus 1842 gets us that calculated monthly bill of $42.66. So let's go through here. Hours needed at minimum wage, 3.29. We're in the green. That's great. So household burden indicator, looking at that bottom 20th percent, 1.84. That is higher than we'd want it to be. So that's kind of not affordable for our low-income community members. EPA residential indicator is in the green at 0.81. So that shows us that our average and above income customers are doing fine in terms of paying this bill. And then we come down and look at this. There's our 2% cutoff. So there's about, 16 or so percentage of people that are paying more than they should for this bill. So let's see what we can do to try to alleviate some of that pain from the lower income customers. So one thing they could do is they can conserve. So let's say they didn't use 4,000 gallons. They used 2,000 gallons because they saw their bill was high. So they decided, let's cut back our usage and we can control our bill that way. Comes out to $30.54. And if we look at our LQI, 1.31. So this was 1.8. So, if they moderate their usage, they can bring this down a bit. They can make it a little more affordable, but it's still not in the green zone of this. And, they've already cut that average usage in half. They're at 2,000 gallons. So, what they can't really, they have to use water. They can't conserve too much more than that. So we're going to have to change this rate structure so they can have the ability to kind of reduce that bill. And the best way for us to do that is to take away this base charge because that's not variable with their usage. So that's not something they can control. They're going to pay that every month regardless. So we'll make that 0. But obviously, if we take that away and recalculate, we're down to $12.12. That is a big loss of income for the utility. Let's look at the average customer here at 4,000 gallons, and they're down to $24.24. So, obviously reducing the bill is going to improve affordability, but we have to be able to, pay all of our expenses as well. So we have to change this table up in a way that's going to make it so we can recoup our losses while still keeping prices low for our low-income customers. So let's clear this. So we had our first rate was $6.06. Let's just keep that. And our customers that were low income, they were going to try to conserve water. So let's say this goes all the way up to just 2,000 gallons. We'll add this to the table. And then, since we've taken that base charge away and this rate is the same, we have to recoup our losses somewhere. So let's raise this rate to $15 and we'll take that to the original first block stop of 7,000 gallons. We'll add that to the table. So for people who want to conserve, they can have a lower bill, and people that aren't as worried about that will have to pay a little bit more, but they're also not paying that base charge. So let's add that final block in. It was $21.72 onward from 7,000 gallons. So that's a really high amount of consumption. So really this rate is really only for commercial customers. Our residential customers won't really have to worry about that. Okay, so let's go back to 4,000 gallons of usage. We don't have a base charge anymore, and the minimum wage was $12.95. And let's calculate that. Originally, the 4,000 gallon usage with the original rate structure and the base charge was $42.66, and now we're back to $42.12. So the average customer is still paying, pretty much the same bill. But for customers who want to conserve, we'll change that to 2,000 gallons. They are only going to change. They're only going to pay $12.12. And if we look at the LQI, boom, we're in the green, 0.52%. For the average customer, the bill was actually slightly reduced. So that is not going to impact their affordability. And so what's going to change is for people that consume more than this. And I'll go to my slides here. I've got a slide showing this little table. So in our original rate structure, people that were conserving to 2,000 gallons paid $30.54. In the new one, they pay $12.12. In the original rate structure, the average consumption customer was paying $42.66. In the new rates, they pay pretty much the same at $42.12. And then we can see that it is the customer who's not concerned with their water bill. Maybe they've got a big grass lawn that they like to keep watered, right? They're going to use 7,000 gallons. Under the original rates, they were paying $60.84, and now they are paying $87.12. And so effectively what we've done here is we've restructured our rates in a way that shifts that cost up the scale of incomes, and kind of it removes the burden from our lower income community members and enhances it on our higher income community members. So, obviously that's not going to be the correct solution for every community, but hopefully this gives you a good idea of how this tool works and how you can use it to run through these different scenarios and find out what kind of changes you need to make to enhance the affordability of, the section of your community that you really want to target. So thank you very much for listening, and that actually wraps up my section here.
Great, thanks so much, Luke. I think it would be great if we could move into Q&A. And for both you and Elsa Marie, we have quite a few questions. And Luke, there were several related to your tool. So while it's fresh, we can start there. The first one is related to, for really, really small areas where you have a zip code that's shared with a much larger city. Is that something that matters when it comes to using your tool?
Yeah, and so that would matter. And, really what we're trying to do is give you all of the tools that you can have to get as close to it as possible. So, in the case where you had a small utility that had a zip code that was shared with a larger city, that larger city's demographic data is likely going to be included in that selected zip code. And so that would skew the results in that example. So you're trying to depend on your local knowledge of the layout of your community to select the thing that is the closest representation of your community. So we worked with some water utilities that they weren't a city or a town, they were a census designated place. And so you can't actually get census data for that. And so for them, the nearest zip code was actually just the best available option. So you kind of have to weigh out your options there. But for some communities, it's much more challenging than if you're just a large city like Albuquerque and they have all that data for you.
Great. And similarly, we had a question about like the 4-digit zip code extensions. Do you anticipate that that would be something that would be available to add to the tool if it were part of data sets that you could access?
Yeah, so I can't answer that off the top of my head, because in terms of implementing it in the tool, the thing that would determine whether we could do that is whether or not we could find the census data for those zip code extensions. And in this moment, I can't say off the top of my head that the census has the data available at such a granular level as that. But we could look into it, and if that is something that users want to see and the data is available, then we would be happy to implement it.
Yeah, could I just pop in real quick, Tess? I think these questions really are all getting at kind of how do you overlay your service area with the census data available, and for these tools, you know, census data for the UNC tool and down to zip code for the UNM tool. You can kind of get to that level. You can also go look up the census data and get down to the blocked or tract level, which might be more granular for some of y'all. But again, I think it's going to be only as good as the census data available. So it's good to get it, but just keep in mind that there's error, you know, there's a margin of error in all of it too. So if you're trying to get super granular, sometimes the margin of error is so large that it yeah, sometimes it kind of encompasses it makes it less meaningful. But I mean, it's good to do the best you can, but once you get down super granular, then it can be challenging to kind of ensure the quality of that data.
Great. And similarly to that, maybe you both can weigh in, you know, there's a lot of benchmarks and standards that you are using in your tools to help understand cost burden. In the case of Luke's tool, it states that less than 1% of LQI is a low cost burden, between 1 and 2% is a mild cost burden. And the question is asking how you went about determining this. And I think, Luke, you can chime in first.
Yeah, so those methodologies were actually developed by the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA has done a lot of work, you know, in their attempts to assess community affordability. And so those benchmarks were actually set by them. And you're right to ask about it, because at the end of the day, it is arbitrary. I mean, it's somebody picking a number, but that's the number that they picked. And it's something that's supposed to be useful to provide you with a strong general idea of your position of affordability. But we didn't develop those ourselves. That comes from the EPA.
Great. And there was a similar question, well, it was along the same lines, that asked about how the current administration, after announcing their Justice 40 pilot program, which states that disadvantaged communities should be receiving 40% of federal funds, is there a degree to which this can influence rate affordability for small drinking water systems? And maybe Elsa Marie, if you want to start and take that one.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's still the intent of the Justice 40 program is to make sure funding gets to small communities, small and disadvantaged communities. So in that sense, there's a lot of potential for that funding to help basically mitigate rate increases that might be needed to actually pay for infrastructure. So say a system would really need to raise their rates by 20% every year for the next 5 years in order to pay for this failing piece of infrastructure. Maybe a grant through an SRF program where they get higher priority points because of this Justice 40 work would be more likely to be funded. But it's still unclear exactly how that kind of the measurements of who's small and disadvantaged and how to get the money out there will happen. So it's not necessarily something that we'll see in the near future. I would say it's probably something in the coming years to decades that we'll see kind of an influence of maybe helping out with some of these potentially like needing to really hike up your rates to pay for a service. Maybe some of that will be mitigated by some of the intentionality to getting the money out to small and disadvantaged communities. But I think we're not going to see that effect in months and maybe not even in years necessarily.
Luke, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess just that, it's not something that, just kind of piggybacking off what Elsa Marie said, the only way that it would really impact your rate affordability directly is by kind of alleviating your need to have financial income from your rates, right? Because you're getting that money from elsewhere, which would potentially allow you to have those lower rates. So it's not something that is guaranteed to impact that. It's just something that has the potential to, depending on the decisions that you make as a result of your changing financial position.
Great, thanks so much. And then there's one more specific question that was related to your tool, Luke, and that was, looking at your rate structure tables. Do you anticipate that a public utility commission might recognize this as a form of calculating rate structure? And is this something that utilities could take to their board?
Yeah, so I would hope that it is, because it was supposed to be intentionally designed to be intuitive to use, but also kind of reflect the way rate structures are designed and the way they work. And so the result here that you see is, sometimes this is exactly what you'll see on the rates sheet. So yes, it would hopefully, if they're familiar with rate structures already, then this shouldn't be foreign to them.
Fantastic. Okay, great. And Elsa Marie, there were a few specific questions about UNC's tool. And one question that was asked early on was, when calculating MHI/residential indicator, do you use combined water and sewer annual service costs, or only separate water only and sewer only annual costs?
I use just water for the Manio example, but I would say you can decide whether or not you want to use just water or water and wastewater. The EPA's guidelines is 2% MHI for water and 4.5 for combined. But again, as Luke said, those are rather arbitrary. But it just you can do it either way. It'll just be a higher percentage if you combine them and lower if you don't.
Great. And then the second question that was really directed towards your tool, Elsa Marie, was on the first sort of page when asked to enter cost for 4,000 gallons. How do you include fixed rate service charges?
You just put the entire rate in there. So with the 4,000 gallons, you can choose whether or not you want to include water or wastewater, just water or water and wastewater, and then you'd put in the rate and the volume, the base and the volumetric charges for it. So it's just kind of the what would show up on the bill for your customers. And if you wanted to, you could also include stormwater, solid waste. You can add in whatever you want, and just make sure that you're consistent across the current and the alternative ones.
Great. And early on in your section, Elsa Marie, and your tool uses this as well, Luke, somebody asked to describe what costs should be included in a base rate.
Yeah, I can take a first shot at that. We often advise small systems to try to recover or try to have their base rate high enough to recover a lot of their fixed charges. So charges that aren't changing or like expenses that aren't changing no matter how much water is used. And that tends to be the majority of costs for a water system. So that often isn't exactly how people calculate costs, because it would make a really high base rate and then really small, sometimes pennies on the volumetric rate, just a couple cents per volumetric rate, because the variable expenses can be so low. So I'd say it's kind of the painful art of setting rates, right, is trying to figure out what's the right balance between all these different factors. And we'll go into that a little bit more in the next webinar as well. But it's good to at least have an idea of what you can recover with your base rate, so that you know that revenue is going to be a lot more stable than the volumetric charges.
Awesome. And there are a few more questions, but I think we're right at the top of our time here. So I think what we'll have to do is I'll just turn it back over to our presenters, Luke Andrews and Elsa Marie Mullins, to close out. And recall, guys, that all of these materials will get shared with you after the webinar. So Elsa Marie, do you want to say anything to send us off?
Sure. I think I would just reiterate that looking at kind of how your rates affect your customers while keeping in mind how to make sure your utility is financially sustainable going forward is kind of the crux of the question of are your rates affordable? But it's really going to be up to you and your decision makers in terms of how you're going to address that question. And I'll just add some of the thoughts in the chat will be addressed in the next webinar as well. So stay tuned for more.
Great. Anything from you, Luke?
I would just, thank you all for coming and for listening to this presentation. And I just want to remind you that, these tools are free. So please check them out.
Awesome. Thanks to the both of you, and I hope everyone has a fantastic afternoon.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.